This is the story of how one of the world's most beloved fairy tales conceals a history of famine, child abandonment, and systematic sanitization that transformed a dark reflection of medieval survival into a children's bedtime story. The version you know, the one you probably grew up with, is a carefully edited lie, softened over decades to hide truths that were once too disturbing to leave intact. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm published Hansel and Gretel in 1812 as part of their collection Kinder- und Hausmärchen, and they weren't writing for children. They were linguists and scholars documenting what they believed to be authentic Germanic folklore. But between that first publication and their seventh and final edition in 1857, something changed. The tale was progressively rewritten, sanitized and reshaped. And in that transformation, we lost something about what this story was really trying to tell us. What actually happened to this tale and why it matters is darker than you might expect. Who the Grimm brothers actually were gets misunderstood by most people. Jacob Grimm, born in 1785, and Wilhelm Grimm, born in 1786, were not folklorists wandering the German countryside collecting stories from peasants around campfires. These men were academics, serious scholars of Germanic linguistics and philology working in Kassel, Germany, and their tale collection was initially intended for other scholars, not for children at all. Their sources weren't predominantly uneducated peasants preserving ancient oral traditions either. Evidence suggests many of their sources were educated, literate people, which makes scholars today question whether the Grimms accurately recorded genuine oral traditions or significantly altered what they received. The tales may have been more literary in origin than purely folkloric, and that changes how we understand what happened next. The first edition of their collection sold poorly, a commercial failure that forced the Grimms to recognize an opportunity. Later editions were increasingly marketed toward children rather than scholars, and this marketing shift demanded content changes that would make the stories suitable for the nursery. Between 1812 and 1857, 7 editions came out, and with each one Hansel and Gretel became less disturbing, less honest about the darkness it originally contained. The most revealing alteration tells us everything we need to know about this sanitization process. In the 1810 manuscript version and the 1812 published version, the person who convinces the father to abandon the children in the forest isn't a stepmother at all, it's their biological mother. Their actual mother is the one who says these children must be left in the woods to die so the parents can survive. By the 1857 edition, the Grimms had changed this character to a stepmother. And this wasn't a small edit, but a fundamental rewriting of the family dynamic at the heart of the story. The idea of a mother abandoning her own children was too disturbing for their new target audience. So the stepmother became a literary device, allowing readers to preserve the sanctity of motherhood while still maintaining the plot. That original version was reflecting a brutal historical reality. Between 1315 and 1317, Europe experienced what historians call the Great Famine, and Northern Europe, including the German territories where this tale originated, was devastated. The climate changed dramatically, crops failed, and millions died across the continent in a catastrophe that made monsters of ordinary parents. During this period and other times of extreme scarcity in medieval Europe, child abandonment actually happened. Families facing starvation sometimes had to make unthinkable choices about which members of the household could be fed, and foundling homes and orphanages increased throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, specifically because economic desperation forced families to reduce their household size. This wasn't folklore or metaphor, but documented reality. The original Hansel and Gretel wasn't trying to scare children. It was processing collective trauma. The story dealt with what happens when there isn't enough food, when survival means impossible choices, when the people who are supposed to protect you can't or won't. And even when the Grimms were collecting these tales in the early 1800s, the context was still relevant. The Napoleonic Wars raged from 1803 to 1815. Right during their collection period, bringing widespread poverty and food scarcity to the German territories, which meant the audiences hearing this story knew what hunger meant and understood the premise wasn't fantasy. The tale also reflects fears that went beyond abandonment. Some scholars link the cannibalism theme to actual cases of famine-driven cannibalism during the Great Famine, so the witch who plans to fatten and eat Hansel wasn't just a random monster, but the embodiment of a very real terror that when resources disappear, the boundaries of human behaviour collapse. That witch carries her own historical weight. The peak period of witch trials in Germany ran from around 1580 to 1630, and during this time an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed across German territories. The majority were women, many were elderly, many lived alone, and many were poor, which means the figure of the witch in Hansel and Gretel, an old woman living alone in the forest, practicing deception, threatening children, may reflect cultural memory of these persecutions. The gingerbread house itself becomes fascinating when you understand the context of scarcity. In a world where hunger was a constant threat, a house made of sweets represented impossible abundance, the ultimate deceptive promise, where food equals wealth equals danger. The children, starving and desperate, can't resist, and that's the trap. When Gretel pushes the witch into the oven where she burns to death, we're watching children commit justifiable homicide. The method matters too, because burning connects directly to the historical practice of witch burning, and the tale doesn't shy away from this violence in any version. Even in the sanitized editions, the witch still burns, which tells you that element was apparently acceptable in a way that a biological mother's abandonment was not. The interpretations of this tale reveal as much about us as about the story itself, and different scholars have seen different truths in the same narrative. Bruno Bettelheim, the child psychologist who lived from 1903 to 1990, published his analysis in The Uses of Enchantment in 1976, interpreting Hansel and Gretel as addressing childhood anxieties about parental rejection and survival. He viewed the witch as representing what he called the devouring mother archetype, a psychological threat of maternal consumption rather than nurturing, and in his reading, the children's triumph symbolized achieving independence from parental protection and learning to survive on their own resources. Jack Zipes, a fairy tale scholar who has written extensively on the Grimms from the 1980s through the 2020s, takes a different approach by noting that the tale reflects class struggles and economic desperation. His work argues that the Grimms systematically sanitized tales for bourgeois audiences, stripping away elements that were too socially uncomfortable or politically challenging, and both interpretations have merit because the tale works on multiple levels simultaneously. The story operates as psychological development and economic reality, family dynamics and social structures, a lesson about children learning they can't always trust adults to protect them, and sometimes they have to protect themselves. Elements you might have missed carry their own meanings. The trail motif is actually a lesson in planning and adaptation, because first, Hansel uses white pebbles to mark the path home, and this works perfectly as the children successfully return. The second time, he can only use breadcrumbs, and the birds eat them, which teaches that what works once might not work again, that you need backup plans, that the environment itself can betray you. In later versions, the Grimms added a white duck that appears at the end to help the children cross water, and this wasn't in the original, but became a symbol of transformation and safe passage to a new life, literally carrying them away from their past. Even in their editions, the Grimms were working with symbolic language that carried specific meanings for their audiences. The tale follows a classification system scholars use for folk tales, designated ATU 327A, in the Arne-Thompson-Uther Index, which means similar tale structures appear across different cultures. An Italian version called Ninillo and Nanella was recorded by Giambattista Basile in 1634, before the Grimms published their version, so this tale type wasn't unique to Germany, and the anxieties it processed were universal. Despite its darkness, or maybe because of it, Hansel and Gretel became one of the most well-known fairy tales globally. Translation into over 100 languages spread it worldwide, and the adaptations are countless, spanning every medium and generation. In 1893, Engelbert Humperdinck composed an opera based on the tale, and it's still performed today, over 130 years later. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, the story has been adapted into films, theatre productions, and literature, with modern retellings often softening or reimagining the darker elements in a continuation of the sanitization process the Grimms began. The tale is also used in therapy and child psychology to discuss abandonment fears, resourcefulness and resilience, sibling bonds, and facing danger. Even in its softened form, it provides a framework for children to process difficult emotions in a safe symbolic space. But the controversy persists about whether such dark tales are appropriate for children at all. Questions about the portrayal of poverty, child endangerment and violence continue, along with discussions about whether the tale reinforces negative stereotypes about elderly women through its witch character. The progressive changes across the 7 editions raise questions about authenticity that scholars still debate. When the Grimms changed the mother to a stepmother, they made the tale less honest about darker aspects of family dynamics, protecting readers from an uncomfortable truth that parents, even loving parents, can fail their children, that survival sometimes requires terrible choices, that the people who should protect you might be the ones who hurt you. The academic community has noted this sanitization, and some see it as a kind of betrayal where changing mothers to stepmothers, softening violence and adding hopeful symbols made the tales more marketable, but less true. We should acknowledge that we don't have complete information about the Grimm's process. The exact identities of many of their oral sources remain anonymous or pseudonymous. We don't have definitive proof of any single real inspiration for this specific tale, though it likely drew from multiple influences. And the precise dates when specific changes were made between all editions would require extensive archival research. What we do know is that the tale you probably grew up with is different from what the Grimms first published, which was itself likely different from the oral versions they heard. The dark truth behind Hansel and Gretel isn't that a witch lived in a gingerbread house, or that children were abandoned in a forest and had to kill to survive. The dark truth is that this tale began as a reflection of real suffering, real famine, real abandonment, real fears about what happens when the social contract breaks down and families can't fulfill their most basic obligations. Over time, that truth was systematically obscured because it was too uncomfortable to confront. And that transformation tells us something about what we're willing to face and what we'd rather hide. The tale in its original form said, "Mothers might abandon you. Hunger makes monsters of everyone. The world is dangerous and adults can't always protect you, and you must be resourceful, clever, and sometimes ruthless to survive." The sanitized version says stepmothers are wicked, good children who stick together will triumph, evil is punished, and everything works out in the end. Which means one version prepares you for a harsh world, while the other comforts you while hiding that world's true nature. The Grimms made a choice for commercial success over uncomfortable honesty. choosing to protect children from the tale's implications rather than prepare them. In doing so, they established a pattern that continues today, the idea that children's stories should shield rather than enlighten, comfort rather than challenge. You might wonder why any of this matters now. Since we don't live in medieval Europe, we're not facing the Great Famine, and most of us don't worry about child abandonment or actual cannibalism. We still tell this story, though. It remains one of the most recognized tales in the world, and every time we tell it, we're making choices about which version to share and what truths to reveal or conceal. And those choices say something about us. The tale continues to be reinterpreted through modern lenses, and recent academic work, as of 2024 and 2025, examines it through economic, feminist, and trauma-informed perspectives. Scholars are increasingly interested in the Grimm's editing process and motivations, with interdisciplinary work combining folklore, psychology, history, and literature to understand how this tale reflects and perpetuates cultural anxieties. The digital age has brought new discussions about the tale's appropriateness and historical context, conversations about what children should be exposed to, how we process collective trauma through storytelling, and what we lose when we sanitize difficult narratives. Hansel and Gretel, in its original form, was a tale about survival in impossible circumstances, about children who couldn't rely on adults and had to become their own rescuers, about hunger both literal and metaphorical, about the choices desperation forces and the strength that survival demands. That's a story worth preserving. Not the sanitized version, not the comfortable lie, but the hard truth about what humans face and how we endure. The dark secret behind Hansel and Gretel isn't hidden in the forest or the witch's house, but in plain sight, in the versions we've chosen to forget, in the edits made to make us comfortable, in the mother who became a stepmother so we could sleep easier at night. The question isn't whether the tale is too dark for children, but whether we're honest enough to tell it the way it was meant to be told, and brave enough to face what it reveals about our history, our fears, and ourselves.